thanks so much for joining us today for When I Grow Up. I am excited for today's guest, who is actually a long time friend of mine. If you listen to the very first episode of this podcast, you'll know that I grew up as a competitive figure skater. And this is Miho Yoshioka, who also was a competitive figure skater. We spent some time and seasons competing together, going to competitions together. I think we went to a few places together, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
New York
multiple.
and stuff. And then we also had the same coach at one time. So we go way back. We lost touch for a while because that's just life, I guess. That's what happens. But Miho is here to share with us about her life and what she does for her job and her career. Miho is hopefully I get it right, okay, a biological science technician with the USDA Agricultural Research Service. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so that's a mouthful, but listen, I promise you folks that this is some cool stuff. You're going to hear about some cool stuff today. But before we hear about her story and her life and her journey to what brought her to where she is now working for the USDA Agricultural Service Research Service, can you tell us what that even is? What do you do? Like, what is a biological science technician? Good
So,
question.
so so biological science technician is a position that a lot of agencies and even outside of the department or agencies not associated with USDA have. It's a government position where you are reporting to usually a scientist. So you are basically the hands-on person who actually performs or executes all of the experiments that are more or less designed by the scientist. You do have say in that as well. But in addition to actually running all of the experiments or collecting the data, you have sort of like a lab manager type role where you have to do everything to basically upkeep and maintain the laboratory that you work in. So that can involve everything from taking chemical inventory of things every year to drafting out standard operating procedures and protocols, to purchasing equipment, to maintaining equipment, and to supervising lab assistants. So a lot of times we have like undergraduate lab assistants sort of serving as interns. And so you're sort of their point person, and also kind of coordinating all of the meetings that your lab may have. That's also something that a lab or a biological science technician does. So it's sort of like a blanket name for these types of positions. But specifically, since I started working with Agricultural Research Service, which I'll say from now on is ARS.
Okay, that's easier.
And then, yeah, ARS. That was a little over 4 years ago. So I've been with the agency for a little over 4 years, and like 3.5-ish of those years I was in Peoria, Illinois. And at that time I was working with the crop bioprotection research unit. So ARS is divided into different locations where they have different research units. So in this sort of umbrella category of agricultural science, there are all of these subcategories, and they're divided into these research units. And the one that I was working at dealt with basically developing microbe or so bacteria, fungi based basically pesticides
Okay.
for important crops in order to basically reduce the amount of harmful chemical pesticides that are used out there. So I was working in a lab doing that in Illinois, specifically working with wheat and potatoes. But since moving to Fort Collins last year,
Oh yes,
I've
that's where you are now, right?
yeah, that's where
Colorado.
I'm living right now. And so I started working still kind of in the plant pathology field with sugar beets, so different crop, but um, I was working sort of in a disease assessment lab where I would test out different varieties of sugar beet and um, with the hopes of sort of coming up with, you know, conclusions about, some varieties are more resistant than others to these pathogens that we were working with, and aiming to kind of direct the breeding program into basically engineering or isolating essentially like seed banks for varieties that are more resistant. Um, and then since December, I've been working with sort of the other part of our research unit, which is called sugar beet or soil management and sugar beet research unit.
Uh-huh.
So now I'm working more in the soils realm, and that was sort of like uh, it was a change that I didn't really foresee, but just things didn't really work out with
Mm.
me in the sugar beet lab, and so um, I was transferred to um, the part of the research unit that deals more with like soil sciences.
Okay,
So
so for people like me that don't know anything about science, right? I'm kind of like, wow, that sounds amazing. But okay, so let's back up a little bit if you don't
sure.
mind. The
Yeah.
USDA is the United States Department of Agriculture,
Yeah.
correct? So basically, you're working with the agriculture that myself and everyone else in America probably consumes, right? The
Yeah.
product, the produce.
Hmm.
What is a sugar beet again? I don't know what a sugar beet is.
So sugar beet, it's
Is it not a beet? It's not a
it
beet.
it is very closely related to like the red and golden beets that you see in the grocery store.
Okay.
But sugar beet is actually a big source of sucrose. So they primarily
Oh.
grow it as a sugar source,
So
like
you're
in addition to like, sugar cane um, and other more common sugar crops.
uh-huh.
Sugar beet is primarily used for sugar. Like it is edible, but it's very, very fibrous. So you
Oh,
don't
so
ever
no
like
one really eats
see,
a sugar
yeah,
beet. Like
nobody really eats the sugar. I mean, it is technically edible, but
you would
it's
just like make it into sugar,
yeah,
basically.
yeah.
So basically you're saving the sugar of America is what you're trying to tell me right now. Is that what you're trying to tell me?
Or at least I was until December.
Okay, but now you're working in the soil, like soil service is what you say? What did you
Yeah, soil
say?
sciences.
So okay, so
So this is not related to sugar beet. So before the research unit was divided into two,
uh-huh.
one being the sugar beet and one being soil management. But then over the years, it sort of merged.
I see. Okay.
Um, but yeah, so now I'm working with soil science and specifically what we're doing in our lab is testing out different like land management practices. So things like tillage versus no tillage, or like um, nitrogen.
You're good. No worries.
um, choking on myself.
No worries. You're good.
um, so things like nitrogen fertilization, um, things um, like changing out crops over the years
Uh-huh.
or the same plot of land, that kind of thing, and to see what those effects are on soil health. So
Uh-huh.
soil health can be everything from like the soil texture to the carbon and nitrogen content to beneficial microbes that are good for nutrient cycling, that kind of thing. So we do different experiments, including some out in the field where we test those out in like a manageable setting.
Okay.
And since I've been working in this since December, and given that I have very, very little soil science background,
Uh-huh.
um, prior to that, it's been a lot of like learning, and
Mhm.
especially like chemistry concepts, because I'm more biology versed. And so it's been a little bit of a challenge getting my head around these like soil chemistry concepts, but I'm taking it as another like learning experience, and I'm enjoying it so far. So
No, absolutely. And I'm sure your higher ups put you there with good reason. So I'm sure they're in good hands. I'm not worried about the soil of America because Miho is there. It
yeah,
just
just
honestly,
I'm
it just
just here
blows
like
my mind.
single-handedly doing all.
Okay, I know there's a team of people that do this, and I know there's other scientists, but for me, I'm like, as someone that's known you for a long time, I just really think it's incredible that you're a part of that, in doing that. And even before you said you're in Peoria doing potato stuff, and I love
Yeah.
potatoes. And I remember when you first started that job, I was like, oh my gosh, you're gonna save the potatoes too? Like, right? Because you said that there were like some problems at the time. Are you allowed to tell me that?
um Problems in Peoria.
Or not problems, but like, you were saying like there was stuff with the potatoes that am I making this up? I could have sworn you said like they're kind of not diseased, but
Well, yeah, like potatoes definitely have their fair share of like fungal pathogens.
okay, okay.
Yeah,
See? Saving potatoes too. I love potatoes.
yeah,
Sorry,
and
I
it's
know that you do much more than that, but for people that don't know anything about science, that's all I hear, and I'm like, that's pretty amazing. Sorry,
no,
us
no, it's
us ignorant people here.
no, don't apologize, because hearing people say stuff like that, it's like it's another reminder of how like unique and enjoyable, or like I guess like gratifying I view this position, working with the USDA, because before I started working in ARS, um, I was doing more wildlife biology. um,
Mm,
I didn't really have too much of like a microbio or agricultural science, for that matter, background. And it's really the first position that I've had where, at the end of every day, I have this, fulfilling feeling, knowing that that was another day of me contributing to, society, really. I
yeah,
mean, we're
absolutely.
here like as ARS employees to um, do whatever possible to, help um, food supplies be sustainable for years to come. And so being a part of that, it's definitely like very humbling, and like I said, very like gratifying to know
Yeah.
that, even if it is such a small part that I hold in that little world, like I am still a part of it. And so um it's a nice little um, perk that I have about my job that I never really had in previous positions.
Mm.
Just knowing that I'm contributing somehow um, to, future generations and current ones too. So
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Definitely. It's amazing. Well, you mentioned before that you were in doing wildlife animal stuff. So let's rewind all the way back. My question now
Quite the history.
is, um, from what I know and I remember, but our listeners have no idea. You weren't, like you said before, you weren't planning to be where you are at right now. But when you first started this journey as a scientist, when you first started college, even, did you kind of know the track you wanted to go in, or what were some of the first steps that you took? Just even in your studies or things like that. Yeah, like what did you major in?
Yeah. So, when you asked me if I knew what my track was going to be,
Uh-huh.
I would say that at the time I thought that I did.
Uh-huh.
At the time I would have said, "Oh yeah, hell yeah, like I'm doing this, this, and this."
Uh-huh.
So I applied. So I guess let me rewind. When I was starting to think about colleges,
Mhm.
um, it was the same time that Hurricane Katrina hit.
Oh.
And there was a series that was written in the Atlanta Journal Constitution called Through Hell and High Water. And it was basically documenting um, interviews with nurses at both Charity Hospital and Tulane Hospital
Uh-huh.
in Louisiana. And I like my mom and I read through those because I think like a new segment came out like every day or every week, something like that. And there was like a series of articles that came out, and I was really inspired by that. And so I actually started to apply, or I applied to colleges thinking that I wanted to get into nursing.
What?
Um,
That's
yeah.
crazy. Okay.
Um, and for the longest time, like my dream college was Georgetown,
Okay.
and I applied for their international health studies, like a nursing program.
Okay.
And it was like I said at the time, I was like super gung ho about it, like and I knew that if I got in, like I would go in a heartbeat. But that was before I had a conversation with my brother, who said, like rather than go for a school that will only give you the opportunity to see nursing
Mhm.
as an option, it might not hurt to apply to like a more, broader like liberal arts program that would, still offer nursing as an option, but you would have, classes and options that are beyond nursing, like everything from, because liberal arts, like you have the sciences, but you also have like the social sciences, and you have a pretty well-rounded
Yeah. That's some sound
education.
advice from your
I
brother,
know,
sounds like.
I know. It's like literally life changing because so I really wanted to get out of Atlanta at the time.
Mhm. I
And
feel you.
so
Yeah.
the only school that I was planning to apply to in Atlanta was Georgia Tech.
Mm.
Because I didn't really want to go to like a huge school like UGA. But and so I thought like, oh, maybe I should look into like Emory, because they have, you know, a bunch of different schools there. If
Mhm.
I, want to stick around after college, like there's a law school, business school, medical school, school of public health. And so it was like a very last minute decision for me to apply to Emory. And I thought like, oh, but it's in Atlanta. Like, I don't know about that. But so after I applied everywhere and I started getting into different colleges, I decided to go visit. And I was, still at the time, I was very enthusiastic. Like I got into Georgetown, and that was the first time that I ever like fell to my knees and like started crying out of joy was when I got into
Oh man,
Georgetown. Like
yeah,
I
I'm
still remember
sure.
it,
Yeah.
like being at the mailbox and like my mom had to like pick me up, and it was like this
Oh.
dream come true. But like I went and visited there, and it was almost instantly that I thought like, oh, like this isn't the kind of vibe that I was hoping for
Oh,
from the
you're
campus.
kidding. That's crazy.
And it was just such a bummer and like deflating more than anything, because like all these years, I had dreamt of this place and it just wasn't what I thought it was.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, and and then shortly after that, I went to go visit Emory, and Emory, like it's in Decatur, which is like very different
Right.
from other parts of Atlanta. And eventually, like my mom and I decided, maybe it's good to have the convenience of being close to home, but you still have that like feeling of being away from, like I still felt like I was outside of Georgia when I went to Emory.
No, I agree. Yeah,
Um,
it's like
it's
that.
just Decatur's like very different. But anyway, so I ended up going to Emory, and at the beginning I thought, I would go on the pre-med track. And I was gonna major at one point, my major was neurobehavioral biology. But as soon as,
Neurobehavioral biology. Is that what you said?
yeah,
Neuro?
neurobehavioral biology,
Okay, I'm not even gonna
um,
pretend I know what that is.
basically like brain science,
Oh,
right?
amazing. Okay.
Um, and, but as I started taking like, you know, human science classes, I thought like, like it's pretty strict, it's pretty, hardcore. And
Mm.
um it just, I mean, I went through them fine, but something just felt missing, but I couldn't really figure it out at the time. So after freshman year, or I guess like in the spring of freshman year, my mom convinced me that I should find some kind of like on campus, like research position,
Oh, okay.
over the summer. And I found this lab that studies West Nile virus.
Oh
Um,
my goodness. I remember the West Nile
right,
virus.
yeah.
Yeah.
So mosquito research, mosquito disease research. And I thought like, well, this, it ties into public health. It's sort of along the lines of what my path was at the time. Um, and it was through that I just like fell in love with field work. Like I was out in the field. I mean, even getting bitten by so many mosquitoes,
I was
in
gonna say
Atlanta of
you
all places.
enjoyed that. Like you have to
But
collect
like
mosquitoes.
setting up traps and like taking measurements out in the field. And we did a little bit of like bird mist netting, which is like bird catching, to like sample their blood. And so it was my first exposure of like science outside, right? Which is not really anything that I had been exposed to before. And um and so I ended up like working for that lab my whole like undergraduate career,
Really? Wow.
after that summer. But um I was really into field work, and my mom had, back in the day when she was 16, she studied, or she did like a foreign exchange program for a
Uh-huh.
year in
Uh-huh.
New Jersey. And ever since then, she sort of instilled in us um, this kind of like, not requirement, but like, she basically told us that you would regret it if you don't study abroad, like when you have the
Ah.
opportunity. And so after sophomore year, I applied to study tropical biology in Costa Rica for a semester my junior year. And that basically solidified my love for wildlife sciences and like doing field work. And so I quickly changed my major from neurobehavioral biology to environmental science.
I'm sorry, what year was this of your schooling?
So this was junior year.
Junior year. Okay.
Yeah. And I had already taken some classes that applied for the or that would apply to the environmental science major. So it wasn't really like I had to backtrack and take all these extra classes. Yeah, so I basically thought like, oh, animals are so much more fun than humans. Yeah, so I studied abroad there, and I finished out my undergrad with an honors thesis in the West Nile Virus lab. So I was able to do like my own project, which I did at the CDC campus next door as a guest researcher. And I was able to sort of use their insectary facilities to conduct my experiments and whatnot, which was pretty cool.
Oh yeah, like can we talk about that real quick? Like your experiments? Because I don't know, I'm really interested. I'm sure a lot of other people would be too. Like what kind of like you're doing experiments on the carrier of the West Nile virus or like the actual mosquito or
So our lab it not only dealt with West Nile but other mosquito-borne diseases. And so
which are what other
so like dengue fever, if you've ever heard of that.
Right. Yes, I have. Like malaria, is that?
Yeah. Yes. Okay. We didn't do any research on malaria, but we had researchers working. Dengue was a big one. My supervisor would go to Peru every year. Chikungunya. But yeah, I guess like the main one was definitely West Nile virus. But what I was doing was not so much working with the virus itself, but with one of the mosquitoes that are pretty common in the Southeast that can transmit West Nile, which is the Asian tiger mosquito. It's an invasive mosquito. And you know, I was more drawn to like the animal itself than like the science of like virus transmission.
Okay.
And so I wanted to look at animal behavior and specifically like egg-laying behavior of these females. And so what I was doing at the CDC was basically testing out different treatments of like pools, because these mosquitoes, they lay eggs in water.
Right.
And so I was manipulating like diet levels of or like, you know, food levels of these pools to see which cups or which treatments the females would prefer to lay their eggs in. So basically getting at the whole concept of like, you know, if we know what draws a female to lay their eggs, can we, you know, take any sort of preventative measures for those pools to not be so readily available?
Listeners can't see my face right now, but I'm like mind blown. Okay, that's amazing. So that's what you did your thesis on and your study on?
Yeah.
Wow. Did you get
and it was so cool
by mosquitoes?
It was cool because, you know, the reason why the CDC campus was such a big draw, and I mean, like, that's what they specialize in, right? Is like infectious diseases. But they have these rooms called, like these lab rooms called insectaries, where you can basically finely manipulate the temperature and humidity and like the lights in these rooms so that you can kind of mimic outdoor conditions
Wow.
without having all of the like noise of other variables that are outside.
Okay. Yeah.
So that was really cool.
Yeah, that's really cool, man. That's so
Yeah.
cool. Okay.
Yeah, so that was great. And like I got a publication out of it, and it was, my first ever publication. So I'm definitely like particularly proud of that one.
Wow. Wait, so this is
Um,
like I can Google it?
yeah.
Wow. That's awesome. I have to do
Yeah.
that after
I
this.
mean, there's the author list is pretty long, and so I definitely had a lot of help, considering that I was still an undergraduate. So, but
But
yeah,
even
it is
then, I think that's
very like
insane.
it is very cool that I got a
Yeah.
publication out of it. Um, but yeah, so um, I guess right before my senior year, I started applying for jobs. And honestly, I don't really remember if I talked to anybody about jobs. Like I remember going to the career center fairs a couple times, but nothing really like jogs my memory in terms of like any sort of like tangible conversation that I had with anybody where I was just like, oh, okay, so that's what I need to do. It was
Mm,
mostly from just like scrambling through different job boards. And
mm.
at the time I knew that Society for Conservation Biology and the Texas A&M job boards were pretty good for like um, environmental science positions. And so those are basically like the main ones that I looked at. And I just, started to throw my hat in multiple rings.
Yeah.
And I got this hit from a center. So it's the US Geological Survey, which is part of the Department of Interior. So another government position um, or in Bozeman. They had a center there called the Rocky Mountain Research Center. Rocky Mountain Research Center. Yeah.
It's okay. Yes.
It's been a while.
No, yeah, it's
Um,
fine. Rocky Mountain
but
Research Center.
so
Got it.
it was a position. It was a biological science technician position.
So the same position,
Um,
like same title as that you have
Same
right now.
title, right?
Okay.
But it was working in a program that studied invasive species and testing different technologies to see if we can control them.
What's an
Um,
invasive species? Like, can I get an
so,
example?
an invasive species is one that is not native to whatever habitat you find it in. So, for example, in Atlanta, an invasive plant is kudzu.
Yes.
So kudzu is not native to the States. It
Uh,
was brought over somehow.
right.
And there's a whole slew of invasive species that you can't even count. But
Hmm.
um, what I was specifically working with were aquatic invasive species. So, because you have ships and, with trading and all of that, it's very easy um, to transport non-natives um,
Sure. Yeah.
into different countries.
Yes.
And so, and even, within the country, you have transportation. And so with that comes, unfortunately, with the risk of getting invasives into whatever land or habitat. And so we were testing out different technologies, everything from like UV to sound waves, and basically experimenting with them at different field sites. And so we were working with like New Zealand mud snails. I had a project on quagga mussels near Hoover Dam. It's a big problem there. We had an Alaska study targeting northern pike because they basically displaced spawning grounds for salmon there.
Oh.
So yeah, we had projects all over, and I would say that most of what I did was outside of Montana, even though we were based in Bozeman.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
and so yeah, so that was my first job out of college, and it was definitely like a big learning experience, and I got a lot of skills out of my under my belt from that. But I kind of missed having like an advisor and doing my own experiments. And
Okay.
so after like about 2.5 years working with that agency, um, I applied for a master's program. And,
Oh, okay.
I had remembered how much I fell in love with frogs when I was in Costa Rica, when I studied there as an undergrad.
Uh-huh.
And so I had this idea in my head that I just wanted to do like frog field biology for the rest of my life.
Holy smokes. Okay.
And so I started applying to all of these frog research programs. And I definitely still had that affinity for studying animal behavior like I
Uh-huh.
did as an undergrad.
Uh-huh.
And so I was specifically looking for research labs that dealt with like frog behavior.
Wow. Okay.
um, and that's how I found my graduate program. So I went to East Carolina University, um, and there's a lab um, that studies this particular species of frog called the Peruvian mimic poison frog. And they were doing a lot of research on reproductive behavior, which I sort of had dabbled in a little bit with,
Right, right.
and that sounded awesome to me. And, the fact that they had the opportunity for me to work in Peru too and do a field season there, it was just like a no-brainer.
Yeah.
So I ended up going there, and a lot of my work was lab based. So they had like a captive frog lab
Oh, okay.
where we would basically maintain this little um, zoo of little poison frogs to work with in the lab. And so, yeah, a lot of my thesis was based on lab work, but I was able to accompany that with a field season that I did in Tarapoto, Peru, which is basically like the jungles of like the eastern foothills of the Andes. Um, and yeah, so I did that, and it was probably the most stressful time
I
that I
mean,
had so far was grad
okay.
school.
Why tell us more about that. Why is that?
So, when I was with the USGS working, after I would go home, I could forget about work.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when I was in grad school, and I think this happens to a lot of people in grad school, is that because you have that pressure of conducting your own experiment and you are the one spearheading that project, like
Uh-huh.
nobody is really like supervising you. I mean, you have your advisor, but
Right.
you are your own boss essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And so you end up going home, and, perfectionist people like me tend to just keep thinking about the
Mm-hmm.
project,
Yeah.
or you keep writing, or you keep reading papers. And it just seemed like I never really got a um, break from work, quote
Mm.
unquote. Um, but I know it is possible for people to not have that sort of like always on mentality when they go through grad school. Like I know people who didn't have the same experience, but like I said, like I have a little bit of a perfectionist in me, and it's hard for me to say no to things. Um, it's yeah, I just tend to like maximize, just on a whole nother level. And so it was basically my own, personality that made me feel a little bit burnt out when I went
Mm,
through grad school.
I see.
Um, yeah,
I
it's
understand that completely.
yeah.
I
Yeah, there's a actually he's a wildlife photographer who recently passed away, and one of his quotes that I really like is it goes something like, it's not verbatim, but it's like, it's not until you know what's more than enough, that you know what is enough,
mm,
or something like that.
yeah.
And I am like a testament of that, because I've gone through this like, constantly incline hill, and it really wasn't until like the last maybe couple of years that I really like got good perspective and started to think about what I should like value in life, and it's
Mm,
definitely not work.
right.
And
Yes.
so, and like my mom always says, like, Miho, if you put in like 70% of your effort, that's basically everybody else's 100%.
I agree. It's
Um,
probably true.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like the pressure that I put on myself more than
Yeah.
anything that made grad school really, really hard.
Mm,
Um, but at the same time, like when you're really passionate about something, it's hard you know, not to go there.
yeah.
Um, and but in the end, like I don't regret doing it for any reason. And I got so many like great learning experience out of it, not just from my research project itself, but just being a grad student. I was paying for some of my tuition by being a teaching assistant.
Uh-huh.
And so I taught a microbiology lab and ecology lab for undergraduates.
Oh, wow.
And it really wasn't until I started teaching that I got more and more comfortable doing public speaking.
Mm.
Because before that, I dreaded public speaking. Like I would get super red in the face, like right away, and my voice would shake. Um, and so I was dreading teaching, but I had to do it. But in the end, like I ended up loving it, because,
Yeah.
you know, not only did I get my public speaking skills like honed in, but it was so nice to like have that connection with a student. And especially if they like, you know, say something that makes you think like, oh yeah, like I guess I did teach that very well. And you can't really teach something well unless you can publicly speak well, So that
Yeah.
was like a really, I guess, proud moment, I guess.
No, absolutely. I think
Um,
that investment too that you're making is just really encouraging to what it is that you're doing as well, you know, as you're learning and you're being able to teach it. And I think you even kind of like um, get a grip of what it is that you really love as you're teaching
yeah,
it too. So,
yeah. And it's sometimes like, it's not until you're forced into doing something that may not be totally enthusiastic about at the beginning, that you end up realizing like, oh wow, like I'm so glad that I did that for myself, because this is like my mom's mantra is like, you never know until you try. And it's so true. Like that has never proven wrong so
yeah,
far.
yeah, definitely.
um
I agree with that. I like that. You never know until you try. Good.
she like made an acronym for it the other day, and I was just like, that's way too long. um but yeah, so yeah, grad school, like it was a proud moment when I graduated. I published that paper. I also did a conference in Cartagena, Colombia, where I presented my research all in
Uh-huh.
Spanish with
In
like a
Spanish?
PowerPoint
In
in
Spanish?
Spanish.
You
Yeah,
speak
so I didn't
fluent
mention
Spanish?
I minored in Spanish as an
Jeez,
undergrad.
Miho, goodness. Talk
um,
about, overachiever here. No, I'm just kidding. I'm
I
kidding.
mean, Spanish, in Atlanta, like you grow up in school learning Spanish. Like I had been speaking Spanish since I was like literally like 5 years old. And so it was just one of those when I was in college, I was like, okay, I might as well just keep going at it
Wow, that's
and
incredible.
minor in it. So, um, and
So you presented
so,
it in Spanish.
yeah, so I had English slides, so like
Uh-huh.
English text,
Uh-huh.
but I presented it or like I talked about it in Spanish. Um, I guess they gave us the option of having the reverse, so like
Uh-huh.
Spanish text with English verbal. But I went with the challenge, of
Of
course,
course.
and it was like countless hours of me practicing. But um, the hardest part was like fielding the questions at
Oh,
the end.
yeah,
There's
yeah,
always like a
yeah,
Q&A after these
yeah.
presentations. But I think I ended up swinging them pretty well because at the end, at this conference, this would never happen in the States, but there was like a closing reception, like
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
outdoor dance party essentially,
Yeah.
because it's Cartagena and like why not? And then there were a lot of like undergrads and like grad students that had been at my symposium, and some of them found me at that party and they were like, oh my gosh, like you did such a good presentation. We understood every bit of it. And like, it's
Wow.
like, you're not Japanese. Like, how did you learn how to speak Spanish so well? And so that was like, a good like stamp of
Yeah,
approval that I got.
absolutely.
But yeah, so that was another like memorable thing that came out of grad school.
So your
Um,
grad school like what you were focusing on again was these frogs, right?
yeah, so I was looking at tadpole begging behavior. So these frogs, um, the tadpole sort of acts like little like chicks, like begging for food from their parents.
Uh-huh.
They do this like vibration with their tails um, to basically elicit like this begging behavior when they're hungry. But what I was actually testing is like, is that really them saying how hungry they are, or is it just some sort of like evolutionary, uh, byproduct that doesn't really have much meaning? Um,
Oh.
and so I was looking at, are they really begging or are they really vibrating more when they're hungrier as opposed to if
I
it's like right after they eat? And then at the same time, I was looking at whether the parents actually pay attention to this vibrational behavior and can they see that a tadpole is actually like really hungry based on how strongly they vibrate their tail.
So what is the conclusion?
So it does look like, so I did sort of like these starvation studies.
Oh
Um,
no, that doesn't sound good, but okay.
basically, like some tadpoles got more food than others.
Okay.
And I did find that the vibration got stronger when they had less food. And then also, when they begged more, the parents would attend to them more.
Oh wow.
Yeah, so I mean, that seems when you just talk about that as just like a story, it doesn't seem all that exciting, but given that this little thing,
No,
it's
that's
like
very exciting.
it's well, yeah, you would say that it's exciting, but you know, concept or like logically, it makes sense in our heads, as humans, right?
Mhm.
Like parents should be able to pick up on if their baby, is hungry or stuff like that. But to be able to have like scientific evidence for that is like a pretty big feat in the whole, realm of animal behavior, because there's so much that goes on with these like social animals that we don't really know if it's just like an idiosyncratic, like random byproduct of like evolution versus it actually being used as like a trigger or a stimulus for another type of behavior. For example, feeding the offspring of your little tadpoles. So like it definitely was like this eureka moment when I crunched all the numbers and I thought that it was almost like too good to be true, right?
Yeah, amazing.
But yeah, and I was able to get some footage of it too in the field, which had never been done before. And like really this species, it has so many like interesting things about it, not just from like a reproductive behavior standpoint, but just even as a poison frog species, like it's so different from a lot of other ones. And so I would consider it still being in its like infancy in terms of like being researched. So it was really nice being a part of that and sort of being the pioneer for looking into its offspring behavior.
Yeah, that is amazing. I like want to just talk about your field work and wildlife, studying. But I also have to ask you about your actual work too.
Yeah. So,
No, I mean, but maybe another conversation at another time for sure.
So when it all sounds like it's like, this glorious life of being a field biologist. You're outside all the time and you get to see all these cool things. But honestly, after my experience in Peru, I realized that I couldn't really see myself being a field biologist forever.
Oh,
I think
really?
it was just like getting older, and your body's fragile to a lot of things, and whether your field work is in like outside in the farms or in a tropical country or like in the ocean, like it's definitely taxing on the body when you're perpetually in that setting. And some people have a thicker skin for that, but for me it was just kind of, I got burnt out. I ran into a bunch of issues when I was in Peru, just like injuries and stuff.
Oh gosh.
And it just didn't feel like something that would be sustainable for me in the long run. And so that's when I started looking at agricultural science, because I didn't really want to fully give up field work, but I wanted more of like a lab-based position. So I thought that agricultural science was kind of like a happy medium where you get the opportunity to work in the fields, and you also get to work in like plant growth chambers. But you do have a lot of like lab-based inside work. But it's definitely different from just like a desk job where you're just staring at a computer all day. It was just like a healthy mix of things that I thought. And so that's why I started applying for agricultural research positions, not really knowing if that was something that I was competent enough for, just because I didn't really have too much of a plant background. But I thought, why not? And at the same time, I was sort of pursuing this idea of science communication too. So that was like another sort of possible professional route that I was considering.
What is science communication?
So basically like mass media
Oh,
writing.
okay. Okay.
And at the time I had this dream of writing for the National Geographic. Um,
That would be cool too.
yeah. And, I considered myself a pretty good writer. But that field tended to be a little bit narrow.
Mm,
And I didn't have too much like formal journalism training
I see.
under my belt. So it was a little bit hard to get hits. Um, and like, I started like a science blog to kind of up my resume. And it was fun, but I don't know if it's something that I can see myself doing forever either.
Right.
Um, but so eventually, like I got this position in Peoria, and it was kind of a surprise because, you know, it was very microbiology, plant pathology
Hmm.
based. Um, and the only sort of microbiology experience that I had before that was I taught microbio as a grad
Oh,
student. I
that's
never
right.
even took microbiology as an undergrad or in grad school. And so it was like, it was pretty telling that the supervisor was like very confident in my previous experience, even though they weren't directly related to like plants or agricultural science for that matter. And
Right.
so I thought like, oh, like the fact that he sees that potential in me like makes me interested and makes me want to work for this guy.
Mm,
Um, and so I ended up moving to Peoria, which is a place that I did not know existed before. Like I had to Google it for sure. Um, but honestly, like it was the best job that I had had, like ever. It
oh,
was,
really? Wow.
and it was the learning experience. First of all, just because coming from a wildlife biology world, it was so different. But it was so like stimulating at the same time because, you know, I quickly started to be passionate in the whole mission of like, you know, contributing towards sustainable agriculture.
Yeah.
And so that kind of like propelled me into like being really enthusiastic about learning about all of these like fungal pathogens, like microbiology techniques. And I thankfully had like such a good supervisor who was never one to, like cut me short. Like he would always patiently like teach me things,
Mhm.
explain, like re-explain things to me. And I could see it. I could see that he like believed that I could do it and that I could succeed in this field that was previously pretty foreign to me.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, and so um, I loved my coworkers. I loved my supervisor, and it was just such a nice work environment. Like I felt good going to work and coming back home from work every day. But at the same time, life outside of work wasn't really panning out.
Mm,
Um, and so, uh, the reason why I stuck it out for a little over 3 years um, was because I just loved what I was doing at
yeah.
work. But eventually, work does not equal life, or it shouldn't. Um, and I was still single, and I thought like, there must be something a little bit more fulfilling outside of work. And so that's why I started looking for positions back, or I don't want to say back, but in the mountains somewhere. That was my goal
Mhm.
because I had such a phenomenal time living in Bozeman, Montana, that
Yeah.
it just it I just had this like constant itch of like I need to get back to the mountains. Like that's where I feel like I'm at home.
Mm,
Um and but at the same time, like these government positions, like they're pretty rad in that, you know, you get great benefits, and the flexibility is just unmatched in my opinion.
Mm.
Um, and so my goal was to stick with the same agency and sort of have like a lateral transfer, if you will.
Uh-huh.
Um, and so I kept looking at ARS positions, and you know, the nature of the work, though, considering it's agricultural research, they tend to be in locations where there's just like, you know, farms.
Right, right. Yeah.
And so there really aren't that many locations that are in like on the coast or in the mountains.
Mm.
But Fort Collins was literally like my top choice in terms of like where I wanted to live out of all of the places that I applied to
Mhm.
for ARS positions. And so as soon as I got this job, it was just like a split second decision. Like I was there already.
Mhm.
Like I was it was another one of those like, oh my gosh, like this is too good to be true. It's like I get to stay with the same agency, but I also get to live in the mountains.
Yeah.
Um, and
That's
so
awesome.
I started working with the sugar beet and soil management research unit.
So, do you, I know I'm sure it's a lot different than what you were doing in Peoria, but um, do you enjoy it just as much as you did in Peoria? Or like, do you still feel the passion about, contributing to the sustainability of the United States agriculture, you know?
Yeah, I definitely do enjoy it.
Mhm.
It's it's crazy how diverse the field of agricultural science is.
Mhm.
Now that I've sort of dabbled in 3 different labs in this agency, I'm starting to learn more and more that it's not about doing research in one single specialty.
Mhm.
And really, like, and with so many other science, or with all science, like, collaboration is key to getting like more productivity, like
Mhm.
more experiments done, more coming up with like creative ideas, and everything from designing the experiments to actually executing them.
Yeah.
Um, and I have been, or I will always be grateful for um, the fact that ever since I joined ARS, I've been able to work with so many different people, so many people from different backgrounds. Um, and I do feel like I've always been part of a team, um, like a constantly collaborating team. And it's, it's not something that I ever really, um, like had so much passion for before this. Um, and, you know, in addition to having like good research being done with a good solid team, you end up learning a lot from those who have those different backgrounds.
Yeah, I'm sure. That's
Um,
amazing.
and so, yeah, like I would say that it's as fulfilling as it was when I was in Peoria. Um, and yeah, I mean, there's so many things that I like about my work. Um, I
Well,
mean,
what is
there's some
the
challenges too, but
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt
no,
you.
no, it's fine.
I was gonna ask, so you're mentioning that, you have to come up with experiments and stuff for your work. I
Mhm.
mean, what does a typical day for you look like then? Is it just doing these experiments or
Um,
does it differ
the,
every day?
it's yeah, it
Okay,
is
okay, that's
in a
why.
word. Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer because the nature of our work, especially as biological science technicians, right?
Mhm.
So um, we don't really have like a routine per
Okay.
se. It's just it depends on what experiment is going on at the
I
time,
see.
what data need to be collected at the time. But I'll say that, well, before this lockdown of shelter in place and teleworking, um, for like a month or so, I had been working on a series of soil samples that had been collected a while ago, and basically looking at their chemical composition, um, to basically see how this particular sorghum litter can decompose within the soil. And so I was running this machine called a pyrolysis gas chromatography mass spectrometry, spectrometer, uh,
Okay.
which is pyrolysis GCMS for short.
Uh-huh.
And it's basically like it burns these, uh, it burns your sample, and the volatiles that come off of that burn
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
interact or react with this, whatever agent you have in there. In this particular case, it's like helium gas, and it reacts with that, and then based on how heavy those chemicals are, it'll get picked up by like a reader that basically quantifies those chemicals and identifies them. um, and
Wow.
so I was running those samples a lot and crunching the numbers for that. But other than that, I was doing, sort of like data analysis, literature searches. So like reading papers,
Mm.
writing out protocols for this pyrolysis GCMS. But I was also doing like chemical inventory stuff for like lab management purposes. So it's really like a mixed bag in terms of what you find in a day,
Yeah.
which is, I think, something that I like about my job, because no 2 days are the same. So it keeps things different, and um, you get to have your feet in like multiple pools, and so
Yeah.
you do feel um, like comprehensive in the work that you do, which is a
Oh.
big draw to the work.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
really neat. Um, I hesitate to even ask, but like, is there something you don't like about your job?
I wouldn't say
Like, what's
that
the
it,
worst thing? What's the worst thing about your job?
so I was actually thinking about this, and um I wouldn't say that there's anything that I don't like, but it comes with challenges. And it's the challenge of um manageability and practicality. And that takes on like two different issues, I think. Like, one is the sort of like the experimental design part of the scientific method.
Okay.
Because, in science, there's like an infinite number of questions that we want to answer, right? But in order to answer those questions in a sound way, you have to have a good experimental design. But at the same time, you have limited resources, like
Mm.
both in terms of like equipment and time, but also like manpower. And that includes like the scientist's sanity, right? So it's hard sometimes to answer questions in a manageable way. Like it's
Mm.
hard to design experiments so that it still tests your hypothesis in a logical way, but within the confines of whatever resources or budget or time that you have available. So
I
that's
see.
definitely a challenge. Like, I wouldn't say it's like specific to my job per se. I think it's like a universal truth of science is that experimental design, like you do have to make some sacrifices here and there and make some assumptions here and there because you have those limited resources to work with.
Interesting.
But the second issue is it kind of goes back to me working for the crop bioprotection research unit in Peoria. So what we were doing is we were basically seeing if a particular microbe was at all effective in reducing the amount of damage that a fungal pathogen could have on said crop, whether it be wheat or potatoes that I was working on. And the thing about that is the research is sort of like twofold in that, first of all, you actually measure like, okay, is this potential candidate for a biocontrol? Is it actually working? Is it actually reducing the amount of disease that you see on this wheat head, for example? But the second part is, okay, even if it does seem like it's working, this product is ultimately going to, hopefully be used on a mass scale.
Mm-hmm.
And with that comes, the requirement of like it being stable for a long time. So what we were doing is all of these sort of like post development experiments where we study how we can maximize the storage value. Basically, is it practical to call it a biological control candidate to where farmers can actually utilize it on like a large scale? And so with any science that you're trying to come up with some kind of solution, you have to think about like, how can it be how can it be readily applied to reality? Like, can it be extended beyond the laboratory? Can it be extended beyond like a little tiny petri dish? So that's definitely like a challenge that is hard for my sort of perfectionist side to grapple with sometimes. But science is slow in that matter.
Yeah.
Like it's very calculated steps, but it does take time to get to like a decent amount of confidence, right? In order for it to be actually implemented in, real things. The only thing that, I struggle with sometimes. But I wouldn't say it's something that I dislike about science. I've definitely just learned to consider it as like a reality of science.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there must be so many challenges, but those two alone seem like challenges that are good. Honestly, those are good challenges in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's good to hear you say that. Yeah,
I
because
mean, like,
some people they don't really understand or they don't want to admit that, science, it's like it's too slow, the solutions being, implemented. And so like, for people to appreciate and respect that is a good challenge to have.
yeah. I mean, especially wanting to use what you've learned.
Or that is like an inevitable challenge to have. It's
But yeah, especially I
sorry,
think
go ahead.
no, it's okay. I think especially just wanting to, use what you've learned and then, make it accessible. I mean, that last challenge especially, I feel like is so necessary. I would be stressed, honestly, if I,
Yeah.
but that's
It,
why I'm not a biologist and I'm not an environmental scientist, but that's amazing, Miho. Thank you so much for sharing just all of that with us and just your life story. I feel like I could talk to you for hours. But um, one thing I do like to ask all of my guests before we end is
yeah.
if you have any advice for people that are maybe thinking about going to the sciences or just even just your own personal advice that you maybe want to share with those that are looking to go to college or anything at all.
I would say that um, setting your goals, your career goals, or your professional goals, or deciding on a career path, those are all not a life and death situation. Like,
Mm,
those are not questions that have like consequence to whatever answer you come up with. You know, it's like, yes, it's good to have a goal and, you know, put in your hard work to achieve those goals. But in terms of knowing what you want to do, that is not, I mean, if you do know at one point what you want to do and you end up doing that for the rest of your life, like kudos. But that is not the end all be all. And like I said, I am somebody who at multiple times thought that I knew what was going to happen like 3 years down the road. And so many unpredictable things happened. Um, and I took so many, you know, unexpected turns, but somehow ended up, you know, in this great place that I'm at. And not to say that I regret any of those decisions. And, you know, I am the sum of experiences, but I would not, if you are not really certain, or if you are not really gung-ho about anything in particular, I would not beat myself um, about that. But at the same time, I think that a lot of what I gained from this whole career path in all these different sciences is it's from me talking to people. It's
mm,
from me being curious about the unknown and not being afraid, or learning that it's okay to dabble in things that are a little bit out of your comfort zone. And so I would say that even if it's just like a little peak in your interest that strikes you, like go to whatever source um, you you can you can access that may have a connection to whatever that thing is. You know, go to talks that are beyond your fields. Like go to talk to your friends' parents about what they do. Like your teachers about how they got to where they are, because more times than not, I think you're going to find out that wherever the person is right now is not something that they predicted. Like it's, you know, life is like an ever changing thing. And with everything else that's non work related, like you can't predict it. And so for people to say, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? I think it's a moot question, because
mm,
um, I think it should be, what do you want to be right now? Like, what strikes your interest right now? And then go for that thing that is right now. And then pretty soon through that experience, as long as you maintain like an open mind and a curious mind, you may run into things that are a little bit, on a tangent from whatever that first path was that you were striving for. And that may lead you to another interest. And that's okay. And it, like, as long as your heart is in whatever it is you're doing at that current moment, like, the future is, it's not something that you can control. And so if you don't know what is, part of that future at that moment in time, like, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
It'll itself out. Just, work hard in whatever it is that you're passionate in at the time, and keep talking to people, keep listening. I would say that those two are like my advice that I can offer up right now.
No, yeah, I love that. I mean, it's true. We don't know what the future holds, and we don't control that necessarily. There are certain things that happen that lead to where you are today. And I think just being faithful with the things that you already have in front of you is great advice. That's exactly the kind of advice I would give too. That's awesome. Thank you so much, Miho, for your time and just sharing life with us. It was so great. I really enjoyed it. I hope you did too. I hope you had fun.
Yeah, this was great. I was honestly a little bit nervous about it, but it was very enjoyable being able to talk about my story and things.
Yes. Well, thank you again. And like Miho said, it is always good to just continue to ask questions and talk to people. And we would love to hear from you guys. If you guys have any questions about the sciences, maybe I can ask Miho to help us out a little bit. If there's anything specific that you would want to know more about, please feel free to reach out to us at podcastwigu@gmail.com. And the Wigu is the acronym for When I Grow Up. So it's podcastwigu@gmail.com. Thanks again, Miho. Until next time, guys. Bye.